Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to discuss Samuel Taylor Coleridge, especially Coleridge, the critic, poet, and person. So we have seen Coleridge is as a poet, I believe. You must have read Kubla Khan or maybe Rime of the Ancient Mariner or Christabel. I mean, Christabel is one of my favorites. So, well, all of his poems are really good, great. So you must have seen something very exotic about his poetry, uh, something very highly imaginative, in his poetry. So his prose is nonetheless a beauty to behold, because what we find of his Biographia Literaria, which is one of his major critical works, and a few of his lectures on Shakespeare and his other writings, his contributions to Saudi, all of these they seem to hold the essence of a man who is more complicated and educated, well educated. I mean, I'm not talking about educated in terms of degrees, but educated in terms of educated mind, the mind that is deeply philosophical, right? We've also seen Coleridge to some extent in discussing Wordsworth, because whenever one appears, the other is bound to appear together. So while living in the Lake District, Wordsworth seems to have befriended Coleridge, and these two must have spent, are supposed to have spent, not two, three. Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Dorothy Wordsworth, Wordsworth's sister, all three seem to have spent quite a bit of time contemplating upon poetry, how poetry seems to work, the creative process of poetry, what kind of subject you should be using for poetry, or what situation are required for poetry, what kind of language could be used for poetry. All of these were the discussions, formed the basis of discussions of these three. And they seem to have also exchanged notes on drafts. If one started writing some poem, they would discuss, that person would discuss with the other, or read it out to the other, so that you know you could get a feedback, as in, like, what friends do, right? And they were both very like-minded initially. So I'm talking about the beginning of years of his life as a poet. Okay, so when he is still unsure about his stand on poetry, but gradually it seems to have changed. It seems to have taken up momentum, and his own ideas, his critical ideas, seem to have taken up a separate entity of its own, which is quite, prominent in his Biographia Literaria. So initially, he seems to have concurred with everything Wordsworth said, or at least most of what Wordsworth said. They must have had argument. They must have had arguments that must have led to some philosophical uh, observations that you could find in lyrical ballads and the later revisions of lyrical ballads. But Coleridge's ideas matured to form to find a very separate way. It took a completely different route from what Wordsworth did, and they seem to have found things that in that they used to discuss while they were friends, publicly highlighted. He Wordsworth seems to have pointed out Coleridge's flaws, and Coleridge seems to have pointed out Wordsworth's flaws. And of course, they seem to have been generous enough to appreciate where appreciation was required for each, right? And yes, so we'll continue. So he lived from 1772 to 1834, the height of Romantic age. So we've already spoken about what Romantic age is, what kind of um, dependence upon intuition and instinct was focused upon during this age, and how man seems to have become the center of everything, all purposes, right? And and in turn, that seems to have led to the idea of liberty, equality, fraternity, how every single person is supposed to be given the right to express, the freedom, or the freedom to live respectably, right? So so in this liberated age, they both lived, and it seems to have been a fertile ground for creating poetry. Now, when you, yeah, a brief introduction of Coleridge here. One of the founders of Romantic Age, alongside Wordsworth, Coleridge was a poet, critic, philosopher, and a clergyman, known for his fantastic poetry replete with mystery and the supernatural. His criticism, unlike his predecessors, dealt not with the critical but with the creative aspect of poetry. So, first of all, I want you to note this one particular word here, clergyman. See, Coleridge was also a clergyman. So he had a very brief stint as a clergyman, because see what happened was he himself was a son of clergyman, okay, clergyman of St. Autry, and following his father's wishes, he seems to have joined Jesus College, and from there on, he seems to have, well, a definite idea of what he's going to be. So when he is offered a position as a Unitarian minister, he takes up that position, as is seen in Hazlitt's essay. If you've read Hazlitt's My First Acquaintance with Poets, you would be struck by the image drawn by Hazlitt of young Hazlitt of Coleridge. So he seems to have been this one round, chubby faced man with a large forehead and a bright aura around him, and who's so much a conversationalist, who seems to have talked non-stop and must have engaged people around him so well. He he seems to have come off in Hazlitt's eye as someone who is very well informed, someone who can talk confidently, speak confidently and fluently and musically. Uh, I believe there's this mention of violin harp in Hazlitt's writing, of Hazlitt's mentioning of Coleridge's sermon. So Hazlitt seems to have attended one of Coleridge's sermons, and he seems to have been impressed so much by this writer, a budding writer at that time. But it was very short lived. This particular career was very short lived, it seems, because he was offered another position where he could become engaged in philosophical and literary endeavors. So Coleridge abandoned his calling for what he was made for. He was made to be a poet, and he returned towards writing poetry and discussing philosophy. So, uh, as far as Coleridge's career is concerned, it is quite erratic. What you see is he seems to have not only been a poet, critic, philosopher, and clergyman, but he also seems to have worked unofficially as you know as a private secretary for British High Commissioner in Malta, and also he seems to have been a teacher for a class of men as aspiring to professional careers, and he seems to have been also a political correspondent for Morning Star and reporter for Courier, and for both London, England, lecturer on politics. I mean, lecturer on politics, religion, and philosophy. And as far as military service is concerned, he seems to have enlisted himself under the British English Army under an assumed name. Uh, Yeah, he was both poet, journalist, literary critic, philosopher, clergyman, private secretary. So you see, he must have absorbed from all of these different branches of different fields of work, and and it is visible, it is quite obvious in what he has written. The corpus of his writing seems to reflect his experiences with all of these occasions. So, speaking of his criticism, you would want to know that it is basically based on one particular work, Biographia Literaria, and a few of his lectures on Shakespeare, though much of his lectures on Shakespeare do not survive, just a handful of notes, and notes taken by the audiences, and a few notes made by him, drafts made by him. So what you see in those lectures is that he is not merely focused on the topic he wants to talk about, but also he speaks on a wide range of topics that is of concern to everyone, philosophical discussions, right? Because, see, to him, every audience mattered, and it was his job as a speaker to engage his audience in whatever manner he could. So, his lectures are rich with anecdotes, philosophical, not merely ramblings, but philosophical excursions, you could call it, right? Excursions, and of course, the topic of his choice for that day as well. So, for instance, no, we'll go to, when we go there, we'll talk about it. For now, suffice to say, unlike his predecessors, he dealt not with the critical but the creative aspect of poetry. You need to understand that there are two kinds of criticism. One would be where you deal with the finished product, where the critic deals with the finished product. And other would be where you deal with the creative process itself. So Coleridge, involved himself, engaged in the second kind, the other kind of criticism, wherein he wondered about how a certain work comes into being, how it is created, how poetry is created. Now, that is something that was not earlier followed, that was not followed before him, right? For instance, if you consider Aristotle seems to have spoken about, you know, factors contributing to the success of a good play, and based on that, he must have devised all these theories, right? The theories of unity of time, or the plot structure of characterization of all of these. Now, Coleridge, he worked, but see, the difference between Coleridge and Aristotle is that Aristotle seems to be working with a finished product. He seems to have been given a bunch of works upon which he could work. He could observe all these plays, and based on the success of the plays or the failure of the plays, he was able to devise certain theories for success, certain methods, certain, you could call it a formula for success. Whereas Coleridge, he mainly worked with, not with a finished product, but with the creation of the art itself, how a certain work is created, what goes into the making of that work, right? So that's where Coleridge seems to have started this tradition of observing the making of a literary piece. All right. So this, yeah. What is the nature of his criticism? As far as the nature of his criticism is concerned, so what you find is Coleridge's criticism is mainly based on philosophical principles and is concerned with the origin of creative process. How origin of creative process is what brings about creativity in a person? What is the necessary component that would make a poet, capable of creating poetry? And the finest kind of poetry. What are the characteristics of a good poet, or the characteristics of good poetry, right? That, so he is mainly concerned with the origin of the creative process than the finished product. Finished product, as in, after the completion of poetry, you tend to look at it and try to understand its features, its aspects, and you wonder about certain devices that have been used. Oh, he is not concerned with any of that. Okay. To establish the principles, in his own words, to establish the principles of writing rather than to furnish rules how to pass judgment on what has been written by others. Okay, so his idea, his main ambition in writing criticism is to establish the principles of writing rather than to furnish rules. Okay, so it is not descriptive or prescriptive. It's not even descriptive criticism, it's not even prescriptive criticism. Descriptive criticism would be that which describes how a certain thing has been made. And he's not even concerned about prescriptive criticism. Prescriptive criticism would be like what Aristotle did. He prescribed, he wanted the writers to follow a certain pattern, certain methodology when it comes to writing plays. He expected the playwrights to create a certain kind of tragic hero who should have a certain characteristic trait, or create a certain or write plays on certain kinds of topics, and avoid certain other topics, or focus on the unities, right? Especially the unity of action, how there should be a consistency in the action itself, how the character should not deviate from its necessary characteristic traits that is engaged from the beginning, right? So Aristotle engaged in prescriptive criticism, whereas Coleridge, his criticism is mainly focused on the creative part of the writing, how a certain work is needs to be created, and it's not even about not even about the physical qualities that he is discussing. That would be descriptive, right? That would be describing what is there in the poem. He's not even talking about any literary devices that are being used in poetry, but rather he is speaking of what is necessary, what components. So to some degree, you could say his ideas are abstract in nature, right? Because he uses terms like for instance, he speaks of the fictive qualities of language. So what is fictive qualities, right? And imagination. He speaks of fancy and imagination. He seems to have drawn a line between fancy and imagination, and he seems to further drawn a line between primary and secondary imagination. So you see, most of it is kind of abstract and impressionistic compared to the more modern approaches of criticism. But it needs to be said that he started the trend of analyzing or trying to figure out or understanding what goes into the making of a poem or a poet. Okay, so he is mainly concerned not with furnishing rules on how to pass judgment. He is not even wondering about how to criticize other people's work. He is not even laying down rules to how to criticize other work, or on what has been written by others, but to the principles of writing itself, what goes into the writing. So his criticism lacks system, because see, as I said, it is a little bit abstract and a little subjective and impressionistic. So there is obviously a lack of system. It is unorganized, okay, but are crucial in a way that open avenues for contemporary critical practices. So what you see is that he laid down an abstract path, a theoretical path on which the later writers got to follow. So what you see in stylistics or narratology now could be related to some degree to Coleridge. Okay. One charge against him that you often come to see is the plagiarism in his critical writings. So, plagiarism, as in he did not deliberately set out to copy others, but he was mainly influenced by, see, as I said earlier, Coleridge was Wordsworth's friend, right? So these two people, they lived together as in lived in the same neighborhood for some time, for about 2 years, in the Lake District, right, in near Grasmere. But after that, they both decided to travel all across Europe. And there he seems to have come across all these German writers, philosophers, and thinkers. And he seems to have read extensively on the philosophical writings of Schelling, of Kant, of Schiller. So all of these writers seem to have made a great impact, have had a great impact in Coleridge's understanding of metaphysics. All right, metaphysics, as in where, especially his ideas concerning poetry or the language of poetry, or how human nature is capable of creating a certain kind of poetry, and what the components of the nature should be, of the human nature should be, to be able to produce highly imaginative poetry. So all of these ideas seems to have grown out of his readings, extensive readings of the German writers. So his lack of intellectual honesty has been called into question. Intellectual honesty, as in wherein he is not being truly honest about putting forth the ideas. The ideas are there, they are well and good, but they have been borrowed quite copiously. Okay. Called into question repeatedly, as quite a few of his concepts in Biographia Literaria have been generously borrowed from German philosophers. His theory on metaphysics, distinction between fancy and imagination, were all borrowed from Schelling and Kant. He called himself High German Transcendentalist. See, he himself has named he's named himself High German Transcendentalist. So he seems to have belonged to a group, or he seems to have identified himself with a group of transcendentalists, and he calls himself High German Transcendentalists. Wellix claims that Coleridge borrowed all of his ideas from the German philosophers of his time, like Lessing, Kant, Schiller, Schlegel, etc., and thus lacks originality. But you see, to even quote from someone else, you need some originality, right? Anyone can parrot someone else's ideas and opinions, but the parroter would not become the sole judge and owner of those ideas. But if you absorb those ideas within you and you are simply quoting them, there is no harm in it. Of course, he does not really quote them per se. He seems to have used them in his lectures. I believe that is no different from what we generally do, what I generally do, right? I read from a book and try to understand its points and relate it to you, right? That does not make me a plagiarizer. Anyway, so there is this charge against him of plagiarism. Plagiarism would be copying from someone, right? So his ideas, people accuse him of not having any original ideas, as in his own ideas expressed in his books, which is a little bit true because he seems to be just echoing the sentiments of the German philosophers he had followed at one point. Now, his critical works, as far as his critical works are considered, um, he is considered to be the founding father of all modern criticism. Who is considered the founding father? Coleridge, right? Well, Wordsworth um, has the honor of being the greatest romantic critic ever, but Coleridge has the honor of being the founding father of all modern criticism. As far as I.A. Richards is concerned, I.A. Richards, another critic of the 20th century, he he calls Coleridge the founding father of all modern criticism. Now, Coleridge is a literary critic and speculative philosopher, is said to have delivered 7 major lectures, of which only 3 remain. So, in all, there seems to have been 7 lectures, and we have only 3. He established principles of writing rather than to furnish. Okay, we already discussed on how he, wanted to establish principles of writing rather than rules on how to pass judgment. So these are some of his critical works: Biographia Literaria, Lectures on Shakespeare and Milton, The Friend, The Table Talk. Now, Lectures on Shakespeare and Milton, these are several lectures spoken over a period of time. It's not just a collection of lecture just done in one short duration, but it is spread across time. So, what you see in these is that he focuses on Shakespeare and also on other philosophical discussions. And what you see is again a comparison between sometimes he seems to compare Shakespeare with the more modern writers, or the ones that are his immediate predecessors. So, what you find is a very unique approach to understanding Shakespeare. There are times when he is openly hostile about certain work of Shakespeare's. For instance, speaking of Love, Sleep is Lost, I believe you do know that play, because it is not one of my favorites either, and I was happy to note that Coleridge spoke so ill of it, because even though it was entirely written by Shakespeare, it still lacks the ingenuity, the charm that you see in the more popular of his other writings, like As You Like It, or the other romantic comedies, right? So and when he is actually genuinely impressed by Shakespeare's other works, he is very openly appreciative of it, right? So that is one of his approaches. And also he seems to find certain biographical content in Shakespeare's writings, or historical content on his writings. For instance, at one point he says how Shakespeare's writing is not really unique because that's how everyone used to write during his time. But what is so special about Shakespeare is that it is the fictive qualities in his writing that actually made it stand apart from the rest of the crowd. Okay. And also at another point, probably, yeah, there's this one point where he says, speaking of his characters, how Shakespeare's characters seem to reflect the man himself. Man here would be Shakespeare. How each character seemed to reflect a little bit of the man, because that's what happens, right? When a writer writes, he puts a bit of himself in that writing, a bit of himself in the character he creates. At least the most adored character, the most important character in the play would be modeled upon to some degree the writer himself. So he compares Hamlet's, you know, Hamlet's character character to that of Shakespeare, or even Polonius, or even at one point there was this comparison to another one of his characters. Okay, I'm forgetting it. But anyway, so what you find is there are multiple approaches to understanding Shakespeare and Milton in his writing, in his lectures. And moreover, he did not stick to Shakespeare and Milton alone. As I said earlier, he catered to the audience. He wanted to engage the audience, and that's why you find so many streams going through each lecture. I believe it's time and I need to end my lecture. So we'll just stop here and we'll continue inshallah in the next class. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Stay safe, be happy. Assalamu alaikum.